joining us today. Since the media advisory yesterday, we have one new case of COVID-19 in our province. This is a female in the Western Health Region between the ages of 20 and 39. An investigation into the source of the infection is underway. As part of this investigation, Public Health is advising that some school-age children will be tested and parents are in the process of being notified. As the potential exposure was more than 14 days ago, parents will be advised that their children do not have to quarantine for a full 14 days, but will be required to self-isolate until the test results are back. There has been one new recovery since yesterday, leaving 20 active cases in the province, and the total number of cases in our province to date is 355.
And in total, we have tested 66,084 people. We now have a total of 3 cases in Harbour-Breton, and Public Health is still investigating and conducting extensive testing to identify the source. While the investigation will continue, the fact is that we may never uncover the origins of this cluster. So a significant part of our focus as well is to identify and contain any cases of COVID in the community. To help us do this, we are now asking everyone in the community of Harbour-Breton to get a COVID-19 test, even those who have not been outside the province or don't have symptoms. Please contact 811 to book an appointment for testing. We have started rapid testing on site for those who have had symptoms less than 7 days, which we hope will increase the speed at which we can detect symptomatic cases. I thank everyone who has taken to social media to show their support for the people of Harbour-Breton. For communities staring them in the face of COVID, this is exactly what they need. They need to know we are all in this together and that their fellow Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are behind them 100%. It is your support that will give people the courage to get a COVID test, with the reassurance that they will not become targets for bullying and discrimination. So we need people to feel safe to come forward for testing so we can find and contain the virus. This benefits everyone. This is the 3rd rural community in our province to see a COVID cluster in recent weeks. For the residents in Grand Bank, Deer Lake, and now Harbour-Breton, this is a very stressful and concerning time. And it is a stark reminder that COVID can be anywhere, anytime. We have seen tremendous cooperation in each of these communities, and I thank them for their support. As I've previously indicated, province-wide shutdowns on the scale we saw in the spring are a last resort. Moving the provincial alert level is an action we would only take if we saw wider spread of the virus in the province. Our goal is community or regional restrictions to contain any isolated clusters that arise. We want to ensure that communities and regional health authorities are supported in their decision making. Our public health team is refining guidance for communities that align with epidemiology and best available evidence so that they have assurance that they are taking appropriate action. As a recap for those who may have just joined us, we have one new case since yesterday's media advisory, and the total number of cases in the province is 355. As I have said before, the reason we have fared so well to date is directly attributable to our strict adherence to the public health measures in place. If not for our strong collective actions, this virus would have progressed much differently in our province. Do not let complacency set in now. Please keep Harbour-Breton front and center in your mind, and remember how you can protect yourself, your family, and your community with our layers of protection. Keep your close, consistent contacts to 20 or less. Stay home if you are unwell, even if your symptoms are mild. Avoid gatherings outside your close, consistent contacts, and avoid crowded stores. Wash your hands often and well. Wear your mask when in indoor public spaces, and stay 6 feet apart from others who are not your close contact. Before I close today, I would like to wish a happy Hanukkah to those celebrating. I wish you a safe and joyful week as you enjoy the festivities with your families. Thank you, Newfoundland and Labrador, and hold fast.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fitzgerald. It is day 279. Happy Hanukkah to my Jewish friend, and again, I echo Dr. Fitzgerald's sentiment. We have 20 active cases, so we're hovering around that number. Obviously, the efforts everyone is making are paying dividends in helping contain this virus. Dr. Fitzgerald referenced in Harbour Breton that the criteria for testing have been broadened. The rapid PCR equipment is down there, is functioning, and results there will take about half an hour. There is a process in place whereby these results for validation purposes are currently being double-checked by being sent out subsequently to the public health lab in St. John's. And those of you who remember back to the winter will know that in the early stages with our PCR testing in the public health lab, we did exactly the same kind of validation, only we used Winnipeg and the National Microbiological Laboratory. The ID now has been in the province a while, and we've been able to get the equipment up, running, and validated. In terms of the other rapid testing equipment, the antigen-based one, that was later arriving, and the laboratory staff in Eastern Health around public health are currently working through the process of getting that ready, should that turn out to be needed in a similar, more inaccessible or isolated community. So we look forward to seeing how the results perform and how we can use this technology should we have further outbreaks in more rural or isolated areas, and maybe this would be very suitable for those settings. In terms of results, you may remember I referenced earlier on in the week that we would change slightly the way the reports were delivered. We have an approach here to divide the province into zones. The reason for that is around preserving the degree of confidentiality and yet making the results more geographically relevant to people within this province. This change to the hub, along with a table that denotes potential source of the infection, as, for example, under investigation or from travel, these kind of things, that will start up on Monday, and those who are interested will be able to access that page from our COVID-19 website. The final piece of news, I suppose, would be the issue around vaccine. As I said earlier, a dummy shipment to test the ability of our thermal shipper to keep things cold was successful, and I'm currently informed that actual dosage trays of the vaccine will arrive in the province early next week, and within no longer than 48 hours, the public health staff will begin a program of vaccination. The Public Health Agency of Canada and Pfizer have insisted that at least the first two sets of deliveries be done from the depot that they arrive at. So hence, for those a couple of thousand individuals, that will have to be done in relation to the depot in St. John's. Hopefully thereafter, having tested and demonstrated that element work, that will then allow the distribution on a more on a wider basis. So we look forward to that. There's still no definite date yet for when the Moderna vaccine will either be approved or distributed. That will certainly make life easier for public health, particularly when getting into rural or more isolated communities, which are a source of priority and concern for us under our guidelines that we've agreed with the national umbrella. So really with that, I echo Dr. Fitzgerald's comments about holding the line and bearing in mind good public health advice about keeping your distance and wearing your mask and being responsible about who you mix with, for how long, and under what circumstances. So with that, Leslie, I'll call a halt and turn it over to you for the rest of the question and answer period.
Thank you, Minister. For the benefit of our speakers, there are 5 reporters registered for today's call. The question and answer session will be conducted in 2 rounds where each reporter will have the opportunity to ask 1 question and 1 follow-up per round. Following this, I will ask each reporter if they have any final questions. Our first questions are from Peter Cowan with CBC. Please go ahead.
Dr. Fitzgerald, the case that we saw yesterday in Harbour Breton, can you give us a little more information about that? Is that also tied to the hospital, like we've seen with the other cases? And is this someone who had close contact with either of the two cases, or is this someone who has also picked it up from an unknown source?
So the investigation into the source is still continuing, so I can't really give any further detail on that at this point. That person was a healthcare worker, but I can't give any further information due to privacy issues or reasons.
And so what has the impact then been on the health facility to have someone else who's testing positive? Does this mean that you're now having to test even more people there? Are more people going into isolation? Perhaps, Minister Haggie, you could address that.
Certainly, thank you very much, Peter. From the point of view of the operations of the health centre, visiting was restricted pretty well immediately upon the discovery of the first case. The long-term care section has been physically separate from the acute care and there's kind of doors and things like that allow a barrier. So they are now being staffed separately. So as in the early spring, late winter, there is no overlap of staff to protect the residents. Central Health are identifying a couple of visitors for each resident, and they have been offered testing. And once those individuals are tested negative, they will be the designated visitors until these restrictions can be eased. I am advised that it is still possible to undertake clinics, and certainly the emergency department in Harbour Breton is still functioning. So we've endeavoured to adapt to the impact of COVID-19, but we've also, I think, seen a maintenance of important service levels there as well.
Thank you.
Our next questions are from Peter Jackson with The Telegram. Please go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Fitzgerald. Given the uncertainty of source in Harbour Breton and the fact that you're now wanting everyone to get tested there, do you feel schools should still be open?
So at this point, we've no evidence that there's any transmission happening within schools. So we do have, criteria for when we would close cohorts within a school, and then closing a school itself, even if there was a person who tested positive within that school, is not necessarily something that we would do. Obviously, it takes there has to be some judgment there on the part of the regional public health staff and the medical officer of health to determine, there may be other issues at play that might weigh in on that decision. But for the most part, we are looking for a source. To date, we found one more case. That's it. We haven't seen anything within schools. So at this point, we don't have any evidence to suggest that we need to close schools.
Okay. And I guess this is a question for the minister. The federal guidelines are such that the Indigenous populations have to be vaccinated, that there's a proportion of the vaccine set aside for that. How are you going about determining the urban Indigenous population for your first batch of vaccination?
That's a very good question. Certainly Indigenous communities have been identified. I think the challenge is around the distribution of the Pfizer vaccine, which once out of an ultra-low freezer has a very limited life. Our vaccination team have in mind a way of delivering that vaccine to rural and isolated communities, such as in Nunatsiavut, who actually have their own public health nurses, and also to Innu Nation. There will be discussions with Con River, for example, about the band and the reserve down there. So those plans are currently maturing. I will be having a meeting with Indigenous leadership and Minister Dempster early next week to discuss those still further. From an operational point of view, certainly the arrival of the Moderna vaccine would be a huge asset in being able to distribute to such communities in in coastal Labrador, for example, because it is far easier to ship.
Okay, thank you.
Our next questions are from Kellyanne Roberts with NTV. Please go ahead.
Thank you. The federal government is beginning a compensation program for anybody who has serious side effects of the vaccine. There are already fears about this vaccine. How concerned should people be with this extra layer of compensation?
From the point of view of vaccine safety, I think Dr. Fitzgerald would be eminently able to testify to that. I think the idea of a no-fault compensation scheme is something actually that's really very old, and it came out of the Creever inquiry, if I'm not much mistaken, some 2-3 decades ago. So again, I think that is an extra layer of reassurance, but certainly in terms of the safety of the vaccine, I think that would be regarded very much as a course of last resort. I don't know if Dr. Fitzgerald has any comments from a public health or clinical point of view.
Certainly from a safety point of view, we look at, as I've talked about previously, this vaccine has gone through the same rigorous safety protocols that any vaccine would go through, and if Health Canada has approved it and deemed it to be safe and effective.
Thank you. And with the vaccine to begin to be distributed in the province next week, is there a priority list set yet on who will be receiving those first doses?
So there are restrictions on exactly what we are able to do with that vaccine. So, the manufacturer has had some requirements for us. So it has to be kept in an area that, has the ultra-low freezer. It cannot be distributed past that. So it has to be administered at the point that it's coming to the province. So for that reason, won't be able to be administered out to, say, long-term care facilities, that sort of thing. So we will have to be looking at other people in our priority, in that first groups, those first priority groups, which would include those healthcare workers who are at the front lines of COVID care and in direct response to COVID, are working in, directly in the COVID response. Sorry.
Thank you.
Our next questions are from Richard Duggan with VOCM. Please go ahead.
Thank you. In terms of this new case that was announced today, how were the children that you said might get tested, how were they exposed in this new case? Like, is this a teacher, a daycare worker? How were they exposed?
So it was a staff member of school. So
now, given that information, are we considering closing down the school or switching to an online model, a virtual model?
Not at this time. We are looking at all ramifications of that. As we said, it's been more than 14 days, so we're outside of that infectious period and outside of that quarantine period. So we're sort of looking at things a little more closely. This is a little bit different than your typical situation that you would have to deal with.
Thank you.
Our next questions are from Peter Cowan with CBC. Please go ahead.
In Harbour Breton, Dr. Fitzgerald, it would seem that the cases there would meet the definition of community spread. I've noticed that you haven't been using that term. Why is that?
Well, we don't have our investigation completed at this time. So, public health is still tracking down some leads. We're still testing people. We want to find out exactly what's going on in that community and looking at seeing if we find other cases, looking at the way this disease may have spread. So once we feel like we have exhausted all those leads and all those possibilities, then we will have to make a decision on that.
Changing topics slightly to look forward to the holidays, anyone who is coming to this province and wants to be out of isolation for Christmas has already been here. I'm wondering if you can give me an idea of how many exemptions you approved for the holiday season, how that compares to the normal sort of volume that you're dealing with, and with the electronic tracking that we now have, how many people, either a day or a week, are coming into the province?
I'm really glad you asked those questions, Peter. I just happen to have some numbers handy. So for December the 16th to the 31st period, digital applications for all travellers total 1,225. Of those, there are 326 who've received exemptions. The others would presumably be residents and or workers on the Labrador-Quebec border who would apply for access. The first 10 days of December saw us an average of just over 1,520 entries, and that would include the Labrador borders, which by and large account for well over half and often two-thirds of any daily total.
Thank you.
Our next questions are from Peter Jackson with The Telegram. Please go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a quick follow to my question about Indigenous population. I was actually curious about the urban Indigenous population. Are attempts being made to identify who would be in the metro region?
Yes, certainly. That's a good question, Peter, and I'm sorry I omitted that group. We're working with the bands and their elected representatives, and the two of it, for example, Con River, to identify their members, and that will be part of our discussions, both directly through the regional health authorities, but also probably more properly through Minister Dempster and Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation. So that's part of the substance of our discussion next week. But the vaccine committee that we have struck is working on that as well from an operational perspective.
Okay, great, thank you. The question I have is that the English School Board now has set up a possible contingency for school not going ahead in January should things get out of hand, I guess. I'm wondering whether the government, the Department of Education, or any other group has worked on any strategies to handle that situation in terms of virtual learning and that sort of thing.
That's a really good question, Peter, but certainly from my perspective, I wouldn't feel qualified to have insight into the NLESD or the school board's operational plans. They, by and large, would have total control over that. Our role in our liaison with the schools and the school board is to provide, through Dr. Fitzgerald's expertise, advice on public health views of what their plans might look like.
Okay, thank you.
Our next questions are from Kellyanne Roberts with NTV. Please go ahead.
Thank you. We've heard that there's been issues with the COVID-19 alert app, some people not being alerted if they've been exposed in a timely manner. How do you know if the app you've downloaded is working?
That's a very good question. In actual fact, I've received notification, I think, late yesterday from the Federal Minister of Health and the Minister responsible for the development of the app. There is a new version, so I would go to Google Play or Apple and make sure you have the latest version downloaded.
Thank you. And with the vaccine, again, being distributed next week, what can people expect when they receive that first dose? What are the mild side effects that, come with any vaccine? What can we expect from this one?
So I think, as you said, what happens with any vaccine, sometimes you can get a little bit of a local reaction around the vaccination site. It can get a little bit red. It may swell a little bit. You may get a little bit of pain in your arm where the injection went in. But generally speaking, those are quite mild. They're short-lived. They go away fairly quickly on their own. And then especially you may see fever, and there are reports that perhaps fever is seen a little more with this vaccine than in some other ones, but that may be a potential side effect of this vaccine. But all of these things generally mean that your immune system is kicking in and doing what it's supposed to do. So they're not generally considered severe or really overly concerning.
Thank you.
Our next questions are from Richard Duggan with VOCM. Please go ahead.
Going back to the case that was announced today, undoubtedly this will spark some concern from parents in the area. What should they be doing now, and how do you allay their fears?
Well, certainly, if public health has identified that a child needs to have a test done, then certainly we would encourage parents to go get that testing done. As we've been saying from the beginning, make sure if your children are sick, they stay home. Practice all those public health measures, physical distancing, wearing your mask in indoor spaces. You make sure you wash your hands frequently and well. All those things which help to protect and are your biggest source of protection really against this virus. And public health is doing the investigation. If parents need to be, if there are students or staff at schools that are identified as having been close contacts of a case or needing testing, public health will be reaching out directly to do that. So if you haven't been contacted by public health, then you haven't been identified as a close contact.
Thank you. And going back to Harbour Breton for a minute, what public health is pushing for everyone in Harbour Breton to get tested. I was just curious about what have you seen so far in terms of numbers of people coming forward to get tested thus far?
I think there are actually quite a number of people who have come forward for testing. Last I heard was over 500, so that's excellent. I'm really happy to hear that. Like I said, the only way we can get a handle on COVID is to find it. So we want to find any cases that may be there. So hopefully people will continue to come out. We've got the rapid test there now for anyone who has symptoms within the last 7 days or the 7 days prior to having the test done. So that will certainly help with a speedier turnaround time.
Thank you.
I will now go back through each reporter to see if you have any final questions. Peter Cowan with CBC. Do you have any final questions?
I do have a couple of hopefully quick ones. What school is involved in this most recent case?
I don't have that information, Peter, sorry. As I said, that was evolving as I was walking out here, so sorry.
And as we're sort of
Hi, and welcome to 1111. I'm Roberta Hewitt, and today I am chatting with Jessica Williams. Jessica has been working with divination tools since the age of 7 when her grandmother taught her how to read tea leaves. About 10 years ago, Jessica developed such a love for tarot that she has recently completed her master's thesis on the religion of tarot at Memorial University. And so, of course, being a tarot reader myself, I am super excited to have this conversation with Jessica today. Hi, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here too.
I love that you are such an expert on tarot. When I started reading, I learned through mentors. I had some wonderful readers who taught me meanings and helped me along the way. But to be honest, I actually don't know a lot about, for example, the history of tarot. So I would love it if you could share some information on that.
Absolutely. Well, tarot started actually as a card game. So, you know how bridge, you play with different tricks and, you get points and for different cards that you play. Tarot was that type of game. And so the major arcana was your trump cards, and then you have your pip cards, which are like the diamond, spades, hearts, and the other, just whatever the things are. Anyways, the interesting thing is that the oldest tarot deck is this deck, which is the Visconti Sephora's deck. And it's definitely Italian Renaissance art. And it was played by the upper echelons of society. So normal people couldn't afford cards. It wasn't a common commodity. And so it was definitely a very upper class, very rich and wealthy game and opportunity for people to play. So throughout the centuries, it was just a game. People played it. What was really interesting was around the time that Egypt was kind of being discovered, the ancient Egypt ideas. There was what they call Egyptomania, that you just went in and like everything was Egypt and everything was related to this ancient Egypt ideology. That's when, during the late 1600s, early 1700s, this idea that tarot was connected with ancient Egypt came into play because they really felt as though there was some Egypt connection. And that was primarily with the Tarot de Marseille deck, which is the deck that, you find most decks are kind of created after, so the Rider-Waite deck and the Thoth deck. And so this was kind of the first deck that moved from being a game to being for lack of a better term, a divination device. So through the Renaissance period into the Enlightenment period, you have a lot of issues going on politically. You have church, the Catholic Church, not liking the dissension that's going on, creating the Spanish Inquisition. You have people in hiding. You have, a lot of stuff going on, which created kind of underground groups or occult and esoteric groups that took spirituality to a different place. They were still spiritual people, but they didn't necessarily believe in the corrupt church. And so they felt as though there was a form of corruption and that we've heard about in relation to the church. So while Christianity was trying to figure itself out, there was other groups, Mason groups, occult groups, esoteric groups, Rosicrucian groups that would meet together. And then you would have individuals who were almost like mages that would sit and study alchemy, and they study Kabbalah, and they study numerology, and they study astrology, and they would, and Hermeticism, that was another one. And they kind of, over the 400-year period to today, from that time period, created this syncretic system of the tool that we use today. Hence why I did my study on the religion of tarot, because I really felt as though it was more like a religious development of this tool and of the process to help us reach our inner spirit, or Gnosticism, as the early Christians would be. So it's about connecting with that internal self, the inner soul, the inner voice, the things that you have there. So it developed through this long period of time, and it went through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And what's kind of unique about this particular group, and why this group is kind of like the foundation or the head of what it appears to be in regards to the tarot creation, was they were what they call a fringe Mason group. They allowed women, which was very unique. At this point in time, in the late 1800s, women weren't allowed in these types of groups. And it spurred this really spiritual development in regards to kind of working with the Kabbalah and doing exercises along meditation and stuff to move themselves spiritually through the tree of life. So that group was very chaotic. It was almost like Days of Our Lives. They had all this drama going on. They had newspaper opinions going back and forth, accusing other members of doing all sorts of different things. And eventually the group folded. Now, the person that came, there's two people that came out of that group that, this is just tarot related. There's lots of actually famous people that did come from that group. But Arthur Waite he developed with Pamela Coleman Smith the Rider-Waite deck, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck as it's referred to now. And then we have Alistair Crowley, who came up with the Toth deck, and that was with Leda Frida Harris that did the artwork on that one. So the Rider-Waite deck really kind of was the most popular deck. It was the one that hit the market. It's the one that everybody talks to and calls it the authentic deck. But what I find fascinating is through all this history is a lot of the lore that you find around tarot has not been really substantiated. So it didn't really come from Egypt. They actually don't, the first reference of it is in 1400 Italy, but they don't really know where it came from before that. So there's still a period of time that we're not sure about where the origins of where these cards came from, but we do know that they were with nobility and aristocrats, and that over a period of time, it slowly changed from being just a card playing game to the tool of spirituality that we use today.
And you referenced the Rider-Waite-Smith now, and it is the most popular, the most well-known deck. I will tell you, I don't like it. I had it in my hands, and I didn't like the images. It didn't speak to me. I actually found it a little scary for some reason. I had to put that one back. I didn't like it. I'm sure you own a Rider-Waite deck.
I do own a Rider-Waite deck, and I don't really resonate with it either. The deck I ended up going and purchasing, and it was just because I was working on my thesis about tarot, and I'm like, I should probably own the most popular deck there is. I did end up purchasing the deck that has the original colors, so they're not as garish. So they have a duller color background to them. You don't have the brilliant yellows, it's a duller, and it's just because that was the color printing palette of the time. And so as you go through time, colors change, what people like change. And most of the decks are built on that system. So a lot of times people will refer to tarot decks as systems. And so you either have the Rider-Waite system, which is basically somebody who's taken the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery and ideology and everything and put that into their own creation. Then you have the Marseille decks. They will do the same thing. Then you have like the Toth-like decks. Not very often do you find a standalone deck that's completely on its own, does its own thing, is on its own terms. That doesn't happen very often, but you can find those tarot decks out there. One is, I will mention the Orbifold deck by Michael Bridge Dixon. He's a reader and tarot creator out in Montreal. So he's a fellow Canadian. And he has, it's the neatest deck. It's just circles, just all these circles creating patterns. And yeah, so inadvertently he ended up creating his own system within the auspices of tarot.
That's amazing. So, Jessica, how many tarot decks do you own?
Well, I have 18, which is actually a small collection. It's not over the top. Some are just major arcana, some are smaller ones, and that's not including my oracle cards. If you start looking at my oracle cards, I'm looking at 25 to 30 decks that I have.
Yeah, I have a slightly smaller collection, so I can relate. There is something about it that when you do read and when you're drawn to cards, you do sort of become a collector, right? Like,
yep.
They're just so beautiful. Do you have maybe a favorite card?
I do. So my favorite card is actually not TV appropriate. It is the Strength card with the Witch's Tarot deck, and that's this deck here. So the next favorite card that I have in that deck that is appropriate is the Wheel of Fortune. I just love the dynamic of this wheel, how, it's not as scary as a lot of times the wheel card can be. For those of you who don't know anything about tarot, but that generally this card means changing a fortune or changing directions or making decisions in which way you're going to go and not necessarily having a clear path or clear choice just yet. But generally what this card means There are other, meanings to it, but that's generally the accepted meaning for it. So, and I just love how it just kind of brings in all of the ages and just kind of the life cycle as well, that we have, because everything exists in a circle rather than a straight line. So,
Right. I agree. I really like that card as well. And I guess when you're reading it, depending on what's around it, so if someone is sort of in a really great place and having a really great run of good luck, and sometimes the wheel comes up to represent potential changes in fortune, so maybe some of that might be reversed. And I generally also encourage them when I see that is to express gratitude, right? Just to be so grateful. If things are really going your way, that's amazing. Be grateful.
yeah, absolutely. Gratitude is definitely a big part of this, and a part of the process too, right? So, other people, and I find actually very grateful when I am reading for other people. It's almost it's a humbling and honoring, because you're allowing me to read you at a soul level. And that is super important, to honor people's souls, because there's some stuff that can come out in readings that, it can be tough to talk about. I've seen a lot. I don't know that I've seen it all, but I've seen a lot. I hesitate to say see it all, because the universe goes, hold my beer.
We'll show you something.
So I don't like to test the universe that way. And so, but it is, because you're sitting with somebody and you're holding, a bit of their soul in your heart when you're reading this. So,
And it is amazing how much, I hesitate to say the word power, you have, but I know from reading, people come to see me or we talk on the phone, and generally people who are engaging the services of a tarot reader, they're maybe at a crossroads, or they're unsure, or they're looking for some guidance or advice. So I do think you have to be careful with that. And sometimes people have so much faith that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that whatever you or I say, they will go and find ways to make it fit into their lives.
Absolutely. And then you can have some just downright skeptics who are like, yeah, none of that is true. And, there's just, and sometimes I'm wondering, I'll sit there and I'll be like, is this really true? And then a message comes in and it's like, boom, this is for this person. This isn't just a random, I'm pulling stuff out of a hat and just seeing where the dominoes lie,
It is pretty amazing. And I guess I came to it when I was about 30 years old. And I remember when I first started,